We are at an important area in as we think about the voting rights bill. That's an important juncture in where we are as a country. As we put that on the forefront, what other issues are going to be in terms of legislation? What are some of the things that we need to keep an eye on?
Well, this infrastructure thing, that's a big, big deal. And I think that what we have to do, though, is think of infrastructure in a much more current term. You know, if you go back through history once again, I know everybody gets bored with me in history, but Abraham Lincoln started the so-called Transcontinental Railroad. That's an infrastructure issue today that was not an issue when he came along. Uh, Dwight Eisenhower, the Interstate Highway, infrastructure only after he did it. Today, the most important infrastructure issue to the country, in my not so humble opinion, is broadband. Electricity to the 20th century was what made rural communities flourish and in many instances connected them to the rest of the world. The 21st century is going to be broadband. And so when you look at things, you can't look at these things in terms of size. And that's what bothers me a little bit, rather in terms of the problem. If you're talking about broadband, and we see an infrastructure bill that it's bipartisan, and everybody's talking about this is so great because it's bipartisan. Well, it's been determined that for broadband to get built out in this country, it requires about 95, 96 billion dollars. So what do they do with the bipartisan bill? Well, that's too much. 65 billion is enough. No, it's enough for two-thirds. So now the question is, if that's all you do, which two-thirds of the country gets the broadband,
Wow,
and which one-third will not get the broadband?
that's right.
In order for the thing to be fair and equitable, you got to bill it out for the whole country. And that, to me, is where the rubber meets the road. And so I say to people all the time, think about the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution that gave the former slaves the right to vote. It passed by one party. It was not a bipartisan vote. So am I supposed to believe that the 15th Amendment is not, let's say, adequate because it did not get a bipartisan vote? No. So a lot of times, and the history is replete with it.
That's right.
You can look at Social Security. I know what a lot of my Republican friends they say, well, they passed on the bipartisan. Yes, it did pass on the bipartisan vote. But the lead up to the vote, all of the predicates that had to be laid were very partisan. And it was not until the other side saw that Franklin Roosevelt was going to be successful is when they decided to cave, so to speak, and made the final vote bipartisan. But the effort was not bipartisan. So I don't want people to tell me that this thing is not good because we can't get bipartisan support for it. That to me is the big issue beyond voting.
Right.
Of course, none of it matters if the right to vote is not protected.
That's exactly right.
And so what we have to do, and I know a lot of people talk about the voting thing. Um, I don't like the filibuster, but there are a lot about government that I don't like. Sometimes you have to tolerate things, but it's been determined that the filibuster is not good for budget considerations. And so we have decided that no one person will be allowed to put the full faith and credit of the United States at peril or risk because of the filibuster. And that's why we have reconciliation language for the budget. I maintain that the same kind of consideration ought to be made for constitutional issues like voting. No one person ought to be able to put the voting rights, the constitutional underpinnings of the country at risk because of the filibuster. If you want to argue about legislative issues like whether or not we ought to build a wall, how wide the wall ought to be, how high the wall ought to be, those are legislative issues that got nothing to do with the Constitution, and let the filibuster apply if you please, but not to fundamental rights like voting.
So I want to pick up in an area that I heard you talk about equity,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a keen interest in equity and looking at equity across a multitude of areas.
Absolutely.
Broadband is one of them. Hopefully, healthcare is right behind that.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other areas we, as Washington Heads of Office Leadership Council, we need to keep our eyes on equity? What other areas do we need to put a focus on, shine a light on? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when it comes to equity, I think that should be a consideration every time an issue comes up. Now, equity as opposed to equality, that's where I think we get tripped up. When we fail to recognize that equity is totally different from equality. That's why when I started trying to put a final name on the legacy that I wish to leave, I called it a center for equity and opportunity. When most times people say equality, I use equity, and I always use my three daughters as an example. They are totally different, so I treat them differently, and that to me we need to really get a grip on. And I would hope that you guys will spend a little time on looking at every piece of legislation that comes through and says, look, uh, what's needed here? What group is needed here? It doesn't mean you are partial to one because you're paying attention to where the needs are. Why should you? Like now,
Right.
when it comes to tax laws, there's not equity there. And what we have to focus on equity. I mean, people says, well, we're going to pass this bill and we could treat everybody the same way. No, this bill did not find everybody in the same place. And so we have to focus on where the needs are. So I maintain that almost every piece of legislation that comes through has the issue of equity uh, sometimes lacking, and we have to look at it that way. Um, I got a great lesson in this really early in my career. There was a Supreme Court decision called Shaw dealing with community development. And I remember reading that case. And, I tell people all the time, I'm not a lawyer, but I can read, so I read the cases. Um, and that talked about a community where they spent an equal amount of money in the white community that they spent in the black community. Well, which was true. But the equity was not there because when they divided up the money, and if the white community already had lights and already had underground piping, um, when they put the same amount of money in that community they put in the black community, and the black community had no underground piping, had no street lights, then they were not treated equitably, though they may have been treated equally. So we have to take a hard look at that stuff.
Thank you so much, Majority Whip, for spending the time with the Washington Heads of Office Leadership Council and our new series on Eyes on Who. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your influence in our nation's capital. We appreciate your friendship. And more importantly, we cannot wait to see what happens next. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.